crate door is shut behind them. Very soon now it will be a life on the ocean wave. And less than a couple of 100 miles away, the ship that will take them to England has just arrived at Durban. She's the Union Castle's 8,000-ton freighter, Kinnaird Castle. A convoy of lorries arrives at Umfolozi. Now the crates have to be loaded onto them. As much of the work as possible is done in the late afternoon. This means the rhinos won't have too long inside their closed crates exposed to the full heat of the sun. This part of the job is something the park rangers are quite used to doing. It goes as smoothly as a military operation. After all, the Natal parks have sent a good many rhinos away to restock other parts of Africa, but they've never yet tackled anything on this scale. If you could set a price on the entire cargo, it would probably be worth many thousands of pounds. But in fact, the rhinos are priceless, because, well, if some appalling natural or man-made disaster overtook their relatives in Africa, the whip-snade herd could well mean the survival of the entire species. In the cool of next morning's dawn, the convoy moves off for Durban. The first leg of the journey will be slow and painstaking, rumbling across the bumpy dust tracks of wild Umfolozi. Beyond the reserve, the first settlements come into view. A few scattered kraals of today's Zulus who work on the land, mostly harvesting sugarcane at this time of year. For them, a passing convoy of lorries is still a sight that merits attention and a gay wave. But it's a sight that is going to become a little more familiar as future consignments of animals are moved elsewhere for safekeeping. After 60 miles of dusty tracks across the bush of Zululand, they at last hit the tarmac road. The modern highway will whisk them through the country that once resounded to the battle cries of the great Zulu tribes and their kings like Chaka and Ketiwayo. But from here on, the sights and signs of old Zululand have a rather more 20th century face. "170 miles and some 5 hours later, the road to Durban hits the coast, the rhinos' first contact with the sea that will soon become their daily outlook. How does a rhino feel when it first hears the sounds of a busy city? Being a rhino, it just goes on eating. The Natal newspapers and radio have been giving reports on the rhino's forthcoming departure for days. And some members of the public who live on the city outskirts are there to see them off. The convoy winds into the heart of the city. It almost looks as if the circus is coming to town. Well, they've made it. A little hot, a little tired, a little dusty, but nothing that a nice long sea voyage won't put right. 2 members of the Whipsnade staff come aboard to welcome their charges. The Kinnaird Castle is used to carrying some very mixed cargoes. This trip, her holds and deck contain canned fruit, tea, pulp, hardboard, steel bars, asbestos, copper, and, of course, 20 rhinos. As in the cargo agreements of all British shipping companies, the Union Castle Line undertakes to, and I quote, properly and carefully load, stow, carry and discharge. This particular cargo is one that everyone, from the crane drivers high up in their cabs to the hands sweating on deck, are handling as carefully as porcelain, or perhaps even dynamite. Rations for the rhinos get less ceremonious treatment. For this rhino, it must already seem a long way from Umfolozi. If it sways like this before you get on board, what's a rough sea going to be like? One thing did bode well for the rhinos. By pure coincidence, the crew of the ship were mostly Zulus, many of them in fact from the districts around Umfolozi. They were quite used to rhinos, and this fact was to make them very, very helpful during the long voyage. The last passenger is put into place. At midday, the Kinnaird Castle is ready to sail. Although it was nice and calm inside the harbour, outside was quite a different matter, and they were soon to run into a nice sou'westerly. And rhinos' stomachs are no more fond of a choppy sea than mine or any other landlubbers.
What's What shall we do with a seasick rhino? What shall we do with a seasick rhino?
Keep him off the feed till he's feeling fine. Oh,
Early in the morning, way and up she rises, down in the depths and up to the skies. It's twice round the deck for his exercises, early in the morning. What you gonna do if he's sinking deeper?
what you gonna do if he's sinking deeper?
Send for the vet and call for the keeper, early in the morning.
Ship's doctors are always much in demand on any cruise. The Rhinos had 2 permanent attendants to look after them. This is John Forrest, a senior Natal Parks ranger, and with him is Harry Stevens, who's in charge of rhinos at Whipsnade Zoo. They began to worry about a rhino that had lost its front horn. It looked as though its injury was turning septic. This rhino began to look rather sick, and they decided that the first step should be to spray the wound with antibiotics. Next, a drying agent squirted from an aerosol. The rhino seemed to find this sensation rather pleasing. The next customer for the sick bay was off his food. It could have been seasickness, but John Forrest suspected worms and prescribed drinking water doctored with a drug. The dose had to be repeated every 2 hours. Fortunately, in a week, the patient was eating heartily again. These first few days at sea contained some of the most anxious moments. John Forrest and his Zulu helpers seldom left their charges alone. The rhinos soon became extremely tame, and it may even be that they benefited from the constant human company. Even a rhino can become bored and morose when cut off from its fellows for too long. In the wild, white rhinos commonly move around in small groups. A few days out, the weather calmed down. Stowed on deck behind the superstructure, the rhinos were well sheltered from the wind and the spray. And when the sun shone, it was almost a luxury cruise. With each rhino now well on its feet, over half a ton of hay was disappearing daily. A lot of hay can get blown all round the ship, and after a while it can get to look like a farmyard. Meanwhile, Harry Stevens had an injury of his own now. That sticking plaster above the nose shows where he got a little too close to the sharp end of a rhino. The Indian Ocean sparkles enticingly. Ahead lies the Cape of Good Hope, and the next port of call, Cape Town. The trip so far had gone smoothly enough, in spite of the occasional worry. But 5,000 miles ahead, a more serious crisis was looming up.
Sleepers, dock strike cleaners, dock strike cleaners. Latest news from the dock, dock strike.
A national dock strike had been brewing in England during the last few days. Now it had become a reality. The strike might easily last until the Kinnaird Castle reached London, and then there really would be some problems. But the rhinos sailed blissfully on. South of the equator, they were escorted by the occasional wandering albatross.